The reason why we're all here at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, the reason why I'm touring Scotland at the moment, the reason why there isn't, as Charlie, where's Charlie gone? As Charlie can tell you, Charlie's outside organising something, he's always organising the next thing, is in constant organisational mode, is that this is the most important thing that's going to happen to us maybe in our generation, but it's certainly going to be one of the most important things. And it's not one of those ones where it's a fine, because, in politics and in life, there are a lot of decisions which are sort of 55-45, 51-49, maybe it doesn't much matter and you can recover from it. This is sort of epoch changing, what happens here. This is straight 1930s stuff. And it's not a difficult decision. It's a very, very straightforward decision. It's wrong. It's as simple as that. There is no. I'm a Londoner, and the only advantage that anyone has yet been able to describe to me of Brexit is that it has had a depressing effect on London house prices. But there are other ways of doing that. We don't need to leave the European Union in order to do it. And there are so many aspects that it's wrong. I hardly know where to start. Should I speak for about 20 minutes, then we'll have a discussion and questions? Because I find that in these events, you've got as much to contribute as I have, and I'm really keen to get the conversation going. But there are all kinds of ways that it's wrong. But coming up to Scotland, one of the ways that it's wrong is, and there's a big debate about what is going to be the future relationships between the nations of the United Kingdom. But let's be clear, whatever the future for Scotland, Brexit is wrong. Whatever the future, there is no future for Scotland, England, Wales, Northern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, all of the nations of the British Isles, which will be enhanced by Brexit. On the contrary, whether our future is going to be as separate nations coexisting or as the United Kingdom, we need to be in the European family. It's absolutely essential that we have our trade and our security guaranteed, and that we don't go back to the 1930s where the existential things about whether European countries are going to be fighting each other and in conflict and unable to trade freely are put in question. And part of the problem, it's almost a kind of self-indulgence, really. It's because we have had this 45 years, let's be frank, where in European terms it's been reasonably successful. 70 years across the European continent, there's a real danger that we're just going to take it for granted and that we're going to bitterly regret the decisions that we take, and our children and grandchildren will say, goodness, what on earth happened there? In the same way as people look back at the 1930s and said, why couldn't you see this coming? And this is one of those cases, which I think is in some ways worse than the 1930s, or even before the First World War, where you can see it at the time. You don't need hindsight to see that this is a mistake. What is the future for us as a political community and as a people that is going to be enhanced by wrenching ourselves out of our trading relations with 27 other European countries, putting our security in danger, and starting to use xenophobic language and discrimination and all that against the people with which we have to coexist if we're going to lead a successful life? There is no good argument for this at all. None. Now, all I've been doing is saying that, which became a sort of controversial thing. It's a sign of how bad things have been. Because you've got to understand that there's a big difference between what's going on in Scotland and what's going on in England. Scotland, overwhelmingly, as in Northern Ireland, which I've been in a lot recently, because the Irish dimension to Brexit is horrendous. I'll talk a bit more about it, because it's so bad. Brexit, I understand Brexit very well, because it's essentially a form of extreme English nationalism. That's essentially what it is. And I understand it because, I've done political battle with English Tories and all that. What's happened is a kind of reverse takeover of the English Conservative Party by UKIP and Nigel Farage. And that's essentially what's happened. And you, unfortunately, have been caught up in almost sort of collaterally in this, because it certainly wouldn't have happened if it was starting anywhere else in the UK. That's been a huge tragedy. But you said that Sajid says that I'm deeply unhelpful. A lot worse is being said about me at the moment. Nigel says I'm a twisting weasel. Jacob Rees-Mogg says I'm a caveman. And so it goes on. Because we're English, we conduct all these debates in a sort of semi-polite way. I mean, I spend longer in TV and radio studios at the moment with Jacob Rees-Mogg and Nigel Forrest, and I do with members of my own family. So I keep the banter going well. And I mean, just can I give you some of the banter? Because, I have to try and make it a bit light-hearted. With Nigel, my banter goes roughly as I'll start with Jacob first, I'll come to Nigel. With Jacob Rees-Mogg, my banter goes roughly as follows. When Emmanuel Macron, the President of France, came 2 months ago on his semi-state visit, and you remember he said he was going to lend us to buy a tapestry, which is going to go to the British Museum on display. Now I think it's a bit of a joke, him lending us to buy a tapestry, if you think what it actually celebrates, but nonetheless it apparently hasn't left Normandy since the 11th century. This is supposed to be a great compliment. But he asked for a return gift, and after much cogitation, Her Majesty the Queen has offered the people of France and President Macron as the return gift Jacob Rees-Mogg. The plan is that Jacob goes on display in the Louvre with pinstripe suit, double-breasted suit, watch chain, the whole lot. And he's going to be there for 8 hours a day, simply standing there, representing all that is best and worst, in my view, mainly worst, but maybe there are some good things about the last few centuries of English history. However, because I have to keep this banter going, because I'm almost doing something almost every month at the moment. However, we've had a message back from the Élysée Palace that, regrettably, the President of France can't accept Jacob, because the Bayeux tapestry is considerably more recent. That's my banter with Jacob. With Nigel, it began as follows. It began as that I would exchange my seat in the House of Lords for his German passport, because he had been spotted in the German embassy a year ago filling out these long forms. And these forms, being Germanic forms, they are extremely long for applying for German citizenship. Anyway, he refused to engage on this one when I was teasing him about it. But he was clearly getting quite irritated about it because the word got out that he was applying for a German passport because his wife's German. So there was clearly something going on. And in great exasperation, but not as great exasperation as the iteration I'm going to tell you in a moment, but in great exasperation he said to me about 2 months ago, "No, Andrew, I wasn't applying for a German passport, it was for my kids," so my children. And I said, now I don't bring people's children into politics, I'd never bring mine in, and don't expect to bring others. But since he had raised it himself, and I was on the rebound immediately, I said, "Nigel, that is wonderful that your children have got German passports, that's brilliant." I said, "But why can the millions of other Brits who've got children your age not also have German passports or European passports? So they definitely want them." He didn't know how to respond to that. But I've got this group, of young desperados called Our Future, Our Choice. Indeed, are there any of them here today? They're organising seriously in Scotland as well, who are mobilising the campaigning for people's votes and all that. And by the way, that's how we're going to win the referendum. People say, how are we going to win the referendum? We don't need anyone who voted 2 years ago to change their mind. I think a lot will change their minds as it happens. We need the young to organise the young. If the young organise the young and the young turn out to vote, and indeed we give votes to 16 and 17-year-olds, as happened in the Scottish referendum, which I'm passionately in favour of, because their future is going to be at stake more than anybody else's, we will definitely win this. Anyway, they're brilliant at stunts. So what they did the day after, our greatest stunt manager, is he turned up at Nigel's house the following morning after this, with adoption papers, saying he wanted to be adopted by Nigel, so that he too could get a German passport. Unfortunately, Nigel's quite good on the rebound too, so he took him down to the pub, and by the end of this, they were all getting like a house on fire, which wasn't the idea at all. So that's the first one, but I've got a new one going with Nigel too, because one of the big issues, we hear all the time this thing called no deal, that the alternative. And Nigel keeps telling me on this now. He's got 2 lines. Unfortunately, they're all quite good at lines. He says, "Andrew, what can you not understand about leave means leave?" He says, "We need to get out." He said, "And we need to get on with it." So I keep saying to him now, "But what is it we're supposed to be getting on with, Nigel? What is it? What is the thing that you want to do? Because you talk about no deal. There is no such thing as no deal. If there is literally no deal next March, then planes don't fly, the ports don't operate, EU residents in Britain don't have a legal basis to stay, vice versa, and so on. So these are huge issues. There has to be a deal of some kind, even if it's a deal which is very different from Theresa May's, but you have to say what it is. And I said, one of the issues that has to be in that deal is, are we or are we not going to pay our debts to the European Union? Because what Boris because of course they can never agree amongst themselves, these Brexiters, what they've said is that some of them have said that they'll pay nothing, some that they'll pay something, but they all agreed they don't want to pay Theresa May's £50 billion. The £50 billion, by the way, is very, very important, because remember the 350 million on the side of the bus, that's already gone west completely, because the government's already agreed to pay 50 billion as our exit fee. So, as the lies come to be exposed and the truth comes out, they haven't got a leg to stand on. Anyway, when I was on LBC, because I go on his show, because I have to try and get some balance, so I was on LBC with Nigel last Sunday. He said, when I said, well, what is it? We got to our usual bit in this conversation. What is it that we're going to do? Get on with it immediately, Nigel. And he said, well, we're not going to pay all this money to the European Union. He said that Theresa May wants to pay. I said, you say all this money, you're going to pay anything? And he said, because he could see the trap coming on this one, he said, well, do you know what I think we should pay? The figure I think we should pay to the European Union is zero. I said, Nigel, that is very worrying to me that you think we should pay zero. I said, because I'm told that you have a pension of £73,000 a year as an MEP. I said, and I don't want you to be a burden on the state. And even worse, I said, now that we know that your children have got German passports, they're not going to be coming over and looking after you, because they're all going to be in Berlin. So I said, we have a big problem here. How are we going to pay for your pension if we're not giving the European Union anything at all? I said, do you want a pension, or you're going to give up your pension? Well, he wasn't volunteering to give up his pension. So I said, well, Nigel, it can't be zero. It's got to be however many multiples of £73,000 a year you intend to live beyond the age of 65. Yeah. And I said, because you're not a complete selfish bastard, I said, I assume you want some of the other people who've worked for the European Commission over the last 45 years who happen to be British, and some of our other debts to be paid too. Anyway, that's where we've left that one at the moment. And I need some suggestions for how I take that one on next time too. Yeah. But underlying the banter are really serious issues. And there are four big sets of reasons when we come to this people's vote, as I hope we will, when Theresa May brings back her treaty, and as I confidently expect now, it'll be voted down in the House of Commons, and we move towards a people's vote. There are four big reasons why we shouldn't be talking about variants of Brexit, good Brexits or bad Brexits, because the only Brexit that is good, in my view, is no Brexit at all. Is the difference between Norway, Switzerland, Canada plus, Canada plus plus, Canada plus plus plus, with the Irish backstop, and the backstop to the Irish backstop. And are you with me all so far? Because this is roughly where we are. And if anyone can explain to me what Canada plus 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 with the Irish backstop and the backstop to the backstop is, then they should get the Nobel Peace Prize, because they're the only person. Remember what Lord Palmerston, the great 19th century Foreign Secretary, said about the Schleswig-Holstein question? Yes. There were three people who understood it. One had gone mad, one was dead, and he was the third, and he'd forgotten it. Well, it's roughly the same with Canada plus 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 with the Irish backstop and the backstop to the Irish backstop. Actually, if you really press me, I do actually understand all these things, but it's ludicrous to think we can explain this and it makes any sense at all. So the right thing to do is not variants of Brexit, which just the only difference between them is how damaging they are and how much damage limitation you do. The right thing to do is to stop the whole thing completely. It was a big mistake. Loads of lies were told to the British people 2 years ago. And in any event, even if you don't think, because I don't think you can rerun the past, and I certainly don't think you can discard the results of referendums and elections, so I'm not in that territory at all. The reason for having a referendum on the terms of Brexit, with the option being to stay in, is that, of course, 2 years ago, there were no terms. There couldn't be any terms. There was a thing called leave on the ballot paper, but nobody knew what leave meant. Some people told us it meant leaving the customs union and the single market. Some people said it meant staying. Some people said that we would have freedom of movement. Some people said we wouldn't. Some people said we would be paying our debts when we leave. Some people said we wouldn't. All this had to be negotiated. And my moment of real understanding of this, because I'm in Northern Ireland a lot at the moment, as I say, because of the significance of the Irish issues, is when somebody said to me in a meeting I did at Queen's University Belfast, they said, when we were making the argument for the second referendum, they said it's very much, they said, Lord Adonis, like the Good Friday Agreement. And I said, what do you mean? And they then explained it. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed, which was 20 years ago, and by the way, it's one of the best things that the United Kingdom has done. I mean, you know, I grew up in London in the 70s when IRA bombs were going off in Regent's Park and so on, so no one wants to return to that. When the Good Friday Agreement was signed 20 years ago, it was put to a referendum. Actually, it was put to a referendum in Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, in both at the same time. And this is what they told me, a copy of the Good Friday Agreement was sent to every voter in Northern Ireland. And it's quite a long document. It's 30, 35 pages. And though it's got big declaratory opening sections about peace and all that, it's quite technical. But most people read it. Why? Because they knew the importance of the vote that they were about to cast. They were being asked to cast a vote, so they knew they had to make up their mind, and they absolutely didn't want a recurrence of the trouble, so they took the trouble to read it. And what this person said to me in the audience was, you should do the same with Theresa May's agreement. When she makes her agreement with the European Union, a copy should be sent to every voter in the country, and with an explanation of what it means, including somebody like the Institute for Fiscal Studies working out what it costs, what it's going to cost you, the average family, and then the people who are opposed to it, those of us who think we're better off without it, we can give our statement, which should also be audited by people who do the sums, as to why we think it's a bad thing. And the killer response to those who say that we're simply trying to rerun the referendum of 2 years ago is that you couldn't do that 2 years ago because there was no agreement. There was nothing you could send. All there was a statement put out by David Cameron that we will take your vote seriously, but it didn't say anything about the consequences of leaving. Tellingly, because this is also my dialogue with Nigel last Sunday, when he says, but people knew we were leaving the customs union and the single market. Well, I had with me a copy of the thing that was sent to every household in 2016, and it said nothing about leaving the customs union and the single market at all. It wasn't there at all. Why? Because that was clearly going to be a matter for negotiations. And remember that David Cameron had told us that we'd be staying in the single market if we left the European Union. So the exact opposite of what Theresa May then said afterwards. By the way, he also told us that he would stay on as Prime Minister, but he resigned the following day. So why should we believe a word he said and anything else either? I mean, there's some sort of fundamental issues about truth. So a copy of the agreement should be sent to every household, and we should have the chance to put our case against it. And the four big arguments I think we should make as to why Brexit should not proceed when that happens are these. Firstly, it will be deeply, deeply damaging to our jobs and our prosperity. And you can debate how damaging, but it will definitely be damaging. The only question is the extent to which it's damaging. Why would it be damaging? 45% of our trade goes to the other 27 member states of the European Union. It's not rocket science why that's true. You know, the first law of economics on trade is that trade halves as distance doubles, which is why we have more trade with the Republic of Ireland than we have with China. Not because, of course, Ireland is larger than China, but just it's so much nearer. And there's this 250-mile border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland where trade goes across the whole time. And not only is that 45% with our EU partners, but another 15% of our trade, so this takes it to 60%, goes to 75 other countries with which the European Union already has trade agreements. Now, all of those, in order just to stand still, all of those have to be renegotiated at the end of next March. Remember, Liam Fox told us these were the easiest trade deals in history? You know, the guy who's apparently accumulated more air miles circumnavigating the globe for less result than anybody in the history of aviation. I mean, the way he's been going. We don't have a single trade agreement yet. There aren't even going to be any until after next March, but nobody has an answer to how we're going to ensure the continuity of our trade with all these agreements fold. What is the right thing to do? It's not damage limitation on trying to get some kind of whatever the latest thing is, a facilitated customs agreement, which gives us some of the benefits of the customs union, but not all, and doing our best to try and roll over the existing trade agreements. The right thing to do, of course, is simply to stay in. And when people talk about trading with the wider world, which of course is great, it's great that we trade with the wider world, with most of the wider world, the EU already has trade agreements, or it's negotiating them at the moment. It's just signed one with Canada. It's agreed heads of terms of one with Japan. And does anybody seriously think that Britain, with a population of 63 million, is going to be stronger in negotiating with President Xi and President Trump, who, in case people haven't noticed, are pretty nationalist in the way that they pursue these things, that we're going to be stronger with 63 million than the European Union is with 500 million? I mean, it's a total and utter farce, the propositions that are being made. So our economy, our jobs, our prosperity all require that we stay in the EU. That's big reason number one. Big reason number two is Ireland. We have huge responsibilities to Ireland, both sides actually. We're all part of the British Isles. We all have to share these islands together. But we, of course, have direct responsibilities to the people of Northern Ireland because they're part of the United Kingdom and because of the Good Friday Agreement. And a key feature of the Good Friday Agreement is not to have a hard border between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Now, as I've got to know Northern Ireland well, as I say, I've been there a lot, 6 times now in the last 3 months, and travelled across the border with border communities and talked to them about what all this means and so on. It is is a genuinely non-existent border in terms of movements across. Deliberately so. This was a deliberate act of policy as part of the Good Friday Agreement in order to see that the communities could work in harmony and that you got the greatest possible interchange between. I mean, you know, if you go to Derry is right on the border, and you know, about half of Northern Ireland is within a few miles of the border because, of course, it's a very small community. The main motorway between Dublin and Belfast, called the A1, the cars don't stop. There's no interruption at all. You don't even know when you've gone over the border. Deliberately, it's the only border in Europe that isn't marked at all. I mean, you know when you've gone over the border to Scotland because there are big signs saying Scotland and then England. There are none between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland as a matter of policy, so that people don't feel that they're moving in and out of different territories. But actually, they do, and they go into from kilometres to miles. That's true, but it takes a while before you notice that as you go through. But it's very poignant because on the old A1, which I was taken on by one of the border communities, where it's not just the road signs that change, but the colour of the road markings change because they haven't done those in recent years. The guy who took me along to show me pointed out the stretch of road, which at the moment there's no border markings at all apart from the different coloured road signs. And it's beautiful green rolling country and so on. But he said to me, in the stretch of 100 yards of road that you can see, with just a few cars going up and down, he said 35 people were killed during the Troubles in booby traps, bombs, shootings and cars, and hundreds were injured. And this was known as the death strip. I mean, this was happening 20 years ago. So let's get real about what the issues are in respect of Northern Ireland. Now, the only way to avoid a harder border in Northern Ireland is not to leave the European Union. Because anything that involves leaving the European Union must involve, unless it's a totally meaningless thing, must involve differences of regulation, tariffs, customs duties and so on between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. And it doesn't matter whether you say, which is the latest jargon, there'll be no fixed infrastructure, and there can be no fixed infrastructure. If there's fixed infrastructure, the paramilitaries will start shooting it down, which is how the trouble started in the 1960s. The fact of the matter is, if you've got different regimes covering tariffs and regulation and so on, you'll get smuggling. The Chief Constable of the Police Service of Northern Ireland, who's not political at all, says the biggest danger that he faces is Brexit because of the possibility of a big increase in smuggling. And if there's a big increase in smuggling across the border, there's already some because of differential VAT rates and rates of duty on spirits. But if we start opening this whole thing up with different customs arrangements across the board, then the paramilitaries will be behind the smuggling. That's how they'll get funded, and he doesn't know where that will end. So if there isn't fixed infrastructure, you'll have to start doing loads of mobile checks, which means, let's be clear what these mobile checks means. This will mean the wholesale stopping of lorries and vans and randomly stopping cars and all of that because of the danger of smuggling. Now, the only way, because it's important to understand what the backstop is. What the backstop essentially says is that Northern Ireland doesn't leave the European Union. That's what it amounts to. It doesn't say it in explicit terms because the EU is trying to be nice to Mrs May, but that's what it amounts to. The backstop is that in the event that there were any what's called regulatory divergence between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland will stay in the customs union and the single market, and European law will continue to apply. Now, the point about it, and this raises a huge additional question there, because if that's going to happen, and the government agreed to that, the UK government agreed to that last December. It's trying to resolve from it now as people have worked out what the implication. I remember Boris said he didn't understand it. He was only Secretary of State for Foreign Affairs, but he can't be expected to understand these things. Michael Gove says he now wants legal advice on Mrs May's next agreement because he didn't understand what the last one was. He's a member of the Cabinet. I mean, this is the kind of farce that's going on at the moment in the government. So they're all trying to resolve from it at the moment. But the truth is they'll have to agree to something like that if there's any Brexit, because the government of the Republic of Ireland simply won't allow the EU to sign any agreement without it, for a very good reason. That this is existential for them if we're starting to get a harder border in Northern Ireland. But if that's going to happen to Northern Ireland, the only way you can then have your customs and immigration controls, of course, is down the Irish Sea. Now, the DUP wised up to that one quite quickly and said they weren't having any of that because that, they said, would dismantle the United Kingdom. So Mrs May then, because she literally, her mission in life then just to survive day by day, what she did, because otherwise she would have been defeated in Parliament, was she agreed to a DUP demand that she put in legislation that there will be no customs or immigration controls down the Irish Sea either, i.e. between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Now, this then leads to a fundamental problem. If there are going to be no border and immigration controls between the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, and there are going to be no border and immigration controls between Northern Ireland and Great Britain, and Northern Ireland, as part of the backstop, has to remain essentially within the European Union, then what does that mean for Great Britain? People are starting to work that one out, including Conservative members of Parliament who worked out, hey, does this actually mean that we might not be Brexiting after all? So they've said that that is totally unacceptable. And she has said that it's totally unacceptable too. But she hasn't got a solution. But I have a solution. We stay in the European Union. And then all of those problems vanish. So the second reason why we should stay is because of Ireland. And this isn't a small issue. I mean, because they pretend it's small. You know, the mind boggles on this one. Jacob's other banter with me, because I keep going on about Ireland. What I now do when I'm doing these discussions with the Brexiters is I say, could you please tell me what your solution to the Irish question problem is? And just wait while they describe it. Now, what's really interesting is that the extreme Brexiters, who happen unfortunately to be the people who are largely in control of the Conservative Party, but what the extreme Brexiters say is they try to pretend it doesn't exist at all. Jacob said to me, wait for this a moment, the answer to the Irish problem is for Ireland also to leave the European Union. Now, that really is going back several centuries. I mean, that's not, and I said, so neocolonialism is now the way that we're going to deal with this, but there is a certain logic to it. If Ireland leaves the European Union too, and they then agree unilaterally to adopt our commercial policy, then, they have got other problems, but there is at least you deal with this this issue. But look, I don't somehow think the Irish people are going to go with that. The last century has taught them one or two lessons about just doing what the English tell them. So that's not going to happen. The other thing that Nigel says to me is that Ireland is tiddly, he says. Tiddly. You can imagine how well that goes down in Dublin. By the way, if Ireland's tiddly, you're very tiddly. I mean, you need to understand this. So you need to start asking Nigel Farage when he doesn't come to Scotland very often, does he? If he does, ask him whether he thinks that because Ireland is tiddly, Scotland is tiddly too. But he then said to me, because I debate with him a lot, I take these things one after another. He said that the Irish issue was entirely got up by Barnier. He said before Barnier started going on about Ireland, no one was going on about it. And I said to him, excuse me, Nigel, I've been to Belfast and Dublin. They were talking about nothing else. And I don't believe they were put up to it by Monsieur Barnier. This is actually real and existential for them too. But it does give you an idea of the mindset, the way they're trying to deal with this issue, which is real, incredibly dangerous if we get it wrong. Let's be clear what might happen if we get this. We've got it wrong in Ireland quite a lot in the past. We get it wrong again. What they're now trying to do, the extreme Brexiters, is simply to pretend it doesn't exist at all. Now, that is really dangerous, because one thing I can assure you does exist is Ireland. It's there. We're not imagining it. It's a real country. It has 6.5 million people, and we have big responsibilities to it. And unless we get this right, then we could be laying a path towards a genuine tragedy. But we've got to get it right anyway, because Ireland is a member of the European Union. They're not going to allow the European Union to agree to any treaty which sells their whole future down the river. My own view, by the way, is that Leo Varadkar is playing a complete blinder. The two best political leaders in the British Isles at the moment are your First Minister, I'm Labour, but her speech in the London rally last Saturday was absolutely magnificent, giving the leadership I wish that the Labour Party in Scotland was giving, which is just to be foursquare against Brexit and in favour of a people's vote. That's what should be happening in Scotland. And that's, by the way, part of the reason I've come, because I always see that part of my job is to push my own party in the right direction, because you might notice my leader's not quite in the right place at the moment. I'm encouraging it strongly. I'm also wanting to encourage my good friend, the Labour Party leader in Scotland, to take a really strong anti-Brexit position. This is all hugely important. But she's doing a great job, and Leo Varadkar is doing a great job. And one of the aspects of the great job he's doing is, ironically, freely, not by an act of neo-imperialism at all, what Ireland has been doing is aligning itself systematically with the social policy of the rest of the United Kingdom. Leo Varadkar has played a blinder in the referendums he's held in the last 4 years on equal marriage in the Republic of Ireland and the right of the Irish people to abortion services. The only place now in the British Isles where neither of those are law is Northern Ireland. Yes. So, and this, you now get into the other surreal one, because I do debates with the DUP too, that it turns out we're not allowed to have any differences between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. This is the whole reason why it is unconscionable that we have barriers down the Irish Sea when it comes to trade or immigration. However, they can opt out of abortion and equal marriage, which I personally see as matters of fundamental rights. My own view is, since there isn't a Northern Ireland Assembly at the moment, is that the Parliament in Westminster should legislate for them, because we have a right to maintain basic equality within and access to rights in the UK. But again, what is the right answer to this? It's not to Brexit. Part of the reason why there isn't an assembly in Northern Ireland, by the way, is because of Brexit. The DUP do not want to take any responsibility for anything in Northern Ireland until Brexit has happened. It's very important to understand this, because what they're doing is unlike Nicola Sturgeon, who is saying one thing in London and the same thing in Edinburgh. She's not pretending that she's taking a different line in both places. What's happening with the DUP is they're saying in London that they want hard Brexit, because, to be blunt, they want a border. Let's be clear what's going on. They want a cultural battle. It's part of their raison d'etre. But they're saying in Northern Ireland that they don't want a harder border. And because, unfortunately, the politics of Northern Ireland, with Sinn Féin not taking its seats, there isn't a proper conventional political debate taking place, which is a real problem at the moment. But the last thing that the DUP want is the Northern Ireland Assembly to be meeting at the moment. Because if the Northern Ireland Assembly meets, then the first big question that Arlene Foster will be asked is, are you in favour of staying in the customs union and the single market? Perfectly straightforward question to ask. Obviously, she should be in favour. The only way you can not have a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland is for Ireland to stay in the single market and the customs union. But what has happened in Westminster is that the DUP have been consistently voting against the single market and the customs union. Why? Because they want the hard Brexit. Now, they'd be found out on that if there was actually political institutions. I mean, could you imagine? You need to do the thought experiment to understand how bad things are in Northern Ireland. Imagine that unilaterally the Scottish Parliament was suspended and that half of the parties weren't taking their seats in Westminster either. I mean, there'd be a slight problem of democracy, wouldn't there? And in particular, how would you debate the big issues that affect you? And how would you get a resolution? That is roughly the situation we have in Northern Ireland at the moment, which to my mind makes it all the more imperative that the Parliament in Westminster does its job and safeguards the interests of the people of Northern Ireland. And the biggest thing we can do to safeguard their interests is not to Brexit. So that's reason two. Reason three is the young and the next generation. I do not meet any students, I mean, apart from the odd occasional UKIP plant, who's in favour of Brexit. I do meetings of students up and down the country, and whereas when you do meetings with people of my generation, there were more divisions. It's an extraordinary fact about Brexit that the younger you go, the stronger the support for remaining in the EU. It's overwhelming amongst the 18 to 24s, but it's very strong amongst the under 30s. And why? I think it's very, very straightforward. What do the young of today want? They want to be able to live, travel, work, forge relationships across Europe. The idea for their generation, and of course they've got to make a future, they're not retired, they're not staying in one place. The world is their oyster. The idea that they might be subject to visa controls to go to Paris, Brussels and Berlin, and that they may not be allowed to work on the continent, is unthinkable for them. But this is not scaremongering. Let's be clear. The Prime Minister announced 2 months ago what her draft immigration policy was going to be if we Brexit. Her draft immigration policy is that we are not going to allow anyone into the country from the European Union, except for special exceptions, who earns under 30k a year. Now, you need to stop and think about that for a moment. Most young people, even if they're going on to be serious professionals, they all start at under 30k a year. So, and of course, because we've got this imperial mentality in London, people think that somehow we can say this, but that the rest of Europe won't react in the same way. Let's be clear. If we say that people from the European continent, mainland, cannot come to the United Kingdom if they earn less than 30k a year, what do we think the European Union is going to do? Is it going to say, oh, that's fine, we don't worry about that? Of course they're going to say, well, in that case, we'll have the same rule in the other way too. Which means that the next generation of young people from England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland will effectively not be able to work on the European mainland. Now, who wants that? Who wants that for their children or their grandchildren? That to be the situation. And that is why young people are overwhelmingly in favour of staying in the European Union, partly because it's altruistic, that they see it as having been open borders rather than closed borders is a good thing, but it's also a matter of immediate self-interest to them. And I completely identify with their self-interest. I've got kids of their age. The last thing that we want is to start erecting borders going straight back to the 1930s that this would involve. I feel it as a fundamental sense of duty. And so do most of the people who are doing Brexit, by the way. Why do Nigel Farage's children want German passports? You have to ask yourself that question. It may have something to do with the fact that they might want to live and work on the continent. I mean, you know, and if it's good enough for them, it's good enough for the others. Fourth and final reason why we should be arguing passionately against Brexit, but we didn't hear much about this one 2 years ago, but to my mind, in some ways, it's the most important reason. It's about peace. In the history of Europe, as it's been a continent with a defined political identity, which is about 1,000 years, Charlemagne and all of that, there have only been 70 consecutive years where we've had peace between the major countries or tribes, if you want to think about it historically, of Europe. And those are the last 70 years. There are no other 70 years since. Now, it may be a complete coincidence that those are the 70 years when we had the European Union and the run-up to the European Union. But you know, firstly, I don't think so. Particularly if you look at what people were reacting against in the First World War and the Second World War. But also, on the precautionary principle, is it sensible to take the risk? Because look at the consequences if we get it wrong, given what had happened in the century before. But to my mind, there's a more compelling explanation than that. Because actually, it's not the case that there's been peace across the whole of Europe for that whole 70 years. There have been a lot of areas of war, including some terrible localised war, the Yugoslav Civil War, which happened in our generation. I mean, really serious. And the threats of wars and virtual wars with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, what was happening in the Baltic states, where it looked for a period as if there could well be a full-blown war as at the end of the Gorbachev era there. Now, what is really interesting about this, I feel this very strongly myself, because the reason I have this name Adonis is my family Cypriot came over in. Cyprus is still a divided island. It's still a demilitarised zone. Nicosia is still the only city in Europe which is divided. And you know, these things are still very real. Is that what is really striking about it is if you take the 28 member states of the European Union, those 28 member states, while they've been in the European Union, not one of them has violated the borders of another European Union state, even though many of them have borders which have been deeply contested with ethnic groups that straddle the borders and so on in the past. Why has that been the case? I believe it is profoundly connected with the European Union itself, because the two big requirements of the European Union in order to join it are that you must be a democracy and you must respect borders. And because the European Union is about prosperity and boosting trade and so on, it has in every case coexisted with an increase in prosperity, and countries that get more prosperous, if they're also democracies and have given commitments to safeguard borders, are much more likely to coexist peacefully. It's not an absolute guarantee that they will coexist peacefully. Look at what's going on in Hungary with Orban and Salvini in Italy, but it's the best. We've never yet worked out a way of giving a greater assurance of peace than that. Now, the point about that is the fundamental argument we should be making is that Europe has worked. You wouldn't know it from the Daily Mail and the Sun and all the rhetoric we've had over the last 30 years, that Europe is bad, it's this faceless bureaucracy in Brussels, it's seeking to undermine our democracy and all that. The fundamental fact is it has worked. It's maintained peace. It's ensured that for 2 generations we haven't had wars. It's ensured there haven't been any violations of borders. And never have those attributes been more important, because on our borders are huge threats. We've got Putin on one border, who has already invaded one sovereign state in Europe, Ukraine, and occupied part of it. We've got his troops massed on the Baltic borders too, where Britain is leading the exercises in Estonia, which are of huge significance, because if Russia thinks for a moment that we might resile from the defence of the Baltic states, who knows what might happen there. And we've also, and this has got worse in the last years, we've got Trump on the other side, and Trump's commitment to Western democracy, liberalism and defence is, well, it depends, it goes from tweet to tweet, doesn't it, as to whether that's going to be robust. And further east, we have President Xi and China, which a bit like what we've been seeing in Saudi Arabia. Have you been following what's been happening in China last week? It's the head of Interpol, who's Chinese, has disappeared. This is the guy responsible for international law and order, who's Chinese. I don't know what he did exactly that the Chinese government didn't like, but he's now disappeared and is thought to have been murdered. And President Xi himself, going back to Mao, has declared himself to be president for life and has effectively abolished the Chinese constitution. This is an extremely unsafe world we're in. It has a lot of the attributes of the 1930s, including very weak economies, which is part of the reason why this is happening. Why is Salvini doing so well in Italy? Why? Because for 20 years the Italian economy has not grown. In Britain, part of the reason why we're Brexiting is because real wages across Britain since the financial collapse of 2008 have gone down by 10%. This is fertile territory for populists and extremists, and all the more reason why we should hang together. But finally, just to conclude, there's this excellent book. Which it's a tenner afterwards, and if you're really unlucky, I might sign it for you. But all of the proceeds are going to of the book are going to a charity which Will Hobden and I are setting up for teenagers from less privileged backgrounds to work and volunteer in Europe. Because one of my views as to what's happened in the past is we don't have nearly enough of our young people actually having an experience of living and working on the continent. We're terrible at languages. I mean, we've got to start putting these things right. So this is our bit of doing it. But in the book, when I was writing it with Will, we got to grips with the history of the European Union and what actually happened in the 40s and 50s, which is really interesting. And I just want to end with this because it goes to the heart of why we're all here at 3 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. The founding treaty of the European Union, the kind of Magna Carta of modern Europe, is the Treaty of Paris of 1951, which set up the European Coal and Steel Community. It was the European Coal and Steel Community which then, with the Treaty of Rome in 1957, became the European Economic Community, set up the common market, developed the single market, which then became the European Union, and is the entity we know now. So it evolved from the Treaty of Paris. To my mind, a huge mistake of British policy after the war was we didn't sign the Treaty of Paris. We stayed out. It was a huge mistake. We then also stayed out of the Treaty of Rome. We bitterly regretted it afterwards. We then tried to get in the 1960s. De Gaulle vetoed us. We didn't get in. There's a real danger, by the way, we repeat all those mistakes again. Because let's be clear, if we Brexit, the idea we can just walk back into the European Union, that's a lot of assumptions there. I'm not sure that the French president and the French president after this one are going to be welcoming us with open arms. I mean, we could have a complete rerun of the 60s. So it's tragic that we weren't part of those treaties. But the really interesting thing when you look at the founding treaties of the European Union is that though the institutions of Europe, what they actually did was primarily about the economy, they weren't primarily about defence, actually, because of NATO, and this coexistence of the European Union and NATO has been crucial to our defence in the last 70 years. But the striking thing is that the treaties themselves, in their opening pages explaining why the nations of Europe have signed them, don't say much about coal and steel or common markets. What they talk about is war, peace and bloodshed. And I just want to read you, because this is the sort of argument we need to be making if we've got a referendum next year. The opening section of the Treaty of Paris of 1951, and what it says is the reason why the 6 original founding members of what became the European Union signed it. This is how it starts. The President of the Federal Republic of Germany, the Prince Royal of Belgium, the President of the French Republic, the President of the Italian Republic, the Grand Duchess of Luxembourg, the Queen of the Netherlands, considering that world peace can be safeguarded only by creative efforts commensurate with the dangers that threaten it, convinced that the contribution which an organised and vital Europe can make to civilization is indispensable to the maintenance of peaceful relations, resolved, and this bit is amazing for an international treaty, resolved to substitute for age-old rivalries the merging of their essential interests to create the basis for a broader and deeper community amongst peoples long divided by bloody conflicts, have decided to create a European coal and steel community. That's the reason why the European Union was founded 70 years ago. It's the reason why we should fight as hard as we can for Britain to stay in it and not to repeat all of the terrible mistakes of the past. Because if we do you know what we're going to have to do? Reinvent the European Union in the future, but after what may be terrible events between now and then. So let's not make those mistakes. Let's stay in. Let's have a people's vote. And let's organise like mad to see that we win it. Thanks. Things like the petition are all good because they all add to the pressure. Will any one of them be decisive? We don't know is the answer. But the reason why they're so important is that what will be decisive is the vote in the House of Commons when Theresa May presents her agreement or has to come to the House of Commons and say she hasn't got an agreement probably in December or January. So all that we can do, which is the reason why the marches are important, the petitions are important, writing to MPs is important, all of that. All we can do is put maximum pressure on MPs to do the right thing when that vote comes. We won't know whether it's been successful until we see the outcome of the vote. But, on the precautionary principle, I think we should do as much as we can. So write to your MP, email them, get going on social media, do petitions, do street stalls, meetings like this, do the lot. Because the more likely we are to win at the end. And the independent petition is clearly a good thing to do, and that can only help. I think increasingly this is the emperor's new clothes, isn't it? I mean, the WTO was supposed to be the whole future of British trade once we leave the customs union and the single market. Well, it turns out we may not be able to get decent terms for even joining the WTO. In a separate neck of the woods, the WTO is collapsing anyway because both President Xi and President Trump want to disengage. President Trump is refusing to appoint trade adjudication judges in the WTO at the moment, which hasn't got much attention. But I'm told by those people who know that on the present rate, because there are so many unfilled posts in the WTO, they won't have the trade adjudication panels. These are the things which we'd be relying on if we're outside the EU and need to start having trade agreements with other countries. There won't be enough judges to hear trade appeals for next year, which means to all intents and purposes the WTO will stop functioning as a means of adjudicating in trade disputes. So it's a complete nonsense, this WTO thing. And what's happened this week helps to expose that, because it makes it clear that even if it's not just a question of getting into the WTO and finding out it doesn't really work for us, but we may not be able to get in on decent terms as a separate state from the European Union in the first place. I'm reasonably confident about it. Shall I tell you why? If there's a majority in the House of Commons for a people's vote, which is the first great thing to happen if we're going to have a people's vote, that majority will, without a shadow of doubt, want one of the options to be Remain. Because the reason there'll be a majority, it will be a majority of all the opposition parties plus about 30 Conservatives who don't want to trash the country, to be blunt. The reason they will all have voted together is basically because they want to remain and they want to give the country an option to remain. And the crucial point is that if there's to be a referendum, it's Parliament that will decide the question, not the government. It will require legislation to have a referendum, and Parliament will decide what the question is. Now, if there's a majority, as I say, for holding the referendum, that majority will definitely insist that one of the options on the ballot paper is Remain. So that one I'm reasonably confident about. The truth of the matter is that that Jeremy Corbyn, by background, has been anti-European. He was strongly anti-European. He was part of that bit of the far left that thought that Europe was a capitalist conspiracy and all that, so you couldn't nationalise everything and so on. He's changed because he's realised that actually that isn't the truth about Europe. And also, of course, his party, the Labour Party, is overwhelming in favour of Europe. I mean, Labour Party members, I should say, are 95% in favour. Labour MPs are overwhelmingly in favour too. So he's had to meet them at least halfway, and that's why in the 2016 referendum he did actually come out in favour of Remain, not loudly and passionately, but he did. He said he was in favour. My own view is that he will ultimately be forced to vote against her Brexit deal and for a people's vote. There's no way he can vote with Theresa May and the Tories for their deal, given that Labour has already got 6 tests we've set out, one of which is to maintain the quote-unquote exact same benefits of the single market and the customs union. So since it's abundantly clear we're not going to have the exact same benefits of the single market and the customs union, have to vote against. Now, once it's voted against, something has to happen. There are only 2 things that can, well, there are 3 things that could happen if the treaty is rejected. There could be a new Conservative leader who has a completely different negotiating strategy. Well, what chance do you think there is of the Conservative Party being able to agree on a different strategy? Because the only strategy that could be successful with our European partners is one that moves towards membership of the single market and the customs union. Well, since there's a civil war going on inside the Conservative Party about that very point at the moment, I don't think that's likely. The second thing that could happen is a general election. Now, I would welcome a general election, but, you know, this thing about turkeys and Christmas, I don't see Conservative MPs voting for an early election, because the only thing that would be certain in an early election of that kind is, I would have thought, evisceration, because the Conservative Party would be going in completely divided. Can you imagine that Theresa May, Jacob Rees-Mogg and Boris Johnson are all going to be on the same platform? I mean, the reason there'll have been this election is because they've all fallen out. So I don't think that's going to happen. And by a process of elimination, you get to a people's vote. Now, as Lord Kerslake, the former head of the civil service, said in the House of Lords when we debated the second referendum last week, he said it's Sherlock Holmes. Said once all the impossible options have been eliminated, you're then just left with the improbable. Is that the Hound of the Baskervilles? Where is it? It comes in. But anyway, and he says that is how he thinks we will end up with the people's vote. That once the impossible options have been eliminated, which is a general election or a completely new negotiation, having failed in the first one, the improbable one, which is Parliament being obliged to vote for people's vote, is the only thing that's left, and that's roughly how I see it. All I can say is I hope not. I can't say for certain that we won't. That's the reason why we're all so passionate about it, is we're trying to avoid that. I hope it's not necessary. I can't be certain it won't be, because the problem is that the instinct for loyalty inside the Conservative Party is very strong. It's just possible that they'll all agree to get out next March into some kind of limbo territory, which basically is the same as now for a longish period of time while they try and work out what to do. And so we end up leaving in stages and then at some stage want to get back again. I think that is possible, and that is essentially what we're struggling against at the moment, to bring home to people that the act of leaving the European Union is the thing that makes the decisive difference. The fact that you have a long transition, you know, a long gangplank before you get into the sea, doesn't alter the fact that you'll ultimately be in the sea, and what you've got to do is to try and avoid that happening. So it's very important we point up the problems of what appears to be a transition where nothing changes being, in fact, as bad as the cliff edge. It's just that the cliff edge has moved a few months or years away from you. And that's the big argument we've got to make. So otherwise, you're completely right. We'll have to experience all of the problems and deprivation of leaving before people realise that this was a huge mistake. And people are capable of making huge mistakes. It has happened. You know, as you look back on it, we got Ireland terribly wrong. You know, it's not the case that we haven't made massive mistakes in the past. We went into the First World War in a fit of absence of mind without quite realising what was happening. The 1930s weren't a great, I mean, we just about managed to achieve it in 1940, but it was a very, very close run thing. It is possible, even for democracies, to make very, very big mistakes. And so we've got to point out the dangers as strongly as we can in the next 6 months so that we don't have to go through exactly the scenario that you were painting. No problem arguing about that. For exactly what I was saying earlier in my remarks, there is no leave proposition at the moment. It's very important to understand that. When Nigel Farage says leave means leave, and we should get on with it, the first question I ask him is, what is it? Because there is not a straightforward leave proposition. What does leave mean for the rights of EU residents in this country and Brits who are residents on the continent? What does it mean about our exit deal with the EU? What does it mean about our trade? What is going to happen with planes flying and ports operating? What is his proposal? So if is going to be a third option, they would need to define it. Now, they can't define it for 2 reasons. Firstly, because they daren't, because it isn't no deal. It's a million miles away from no deal as soon as they start defining it. But the second thing is they can't agree on it between them. If you just take a basic issue like immigration, which after all, insofar as there was a reason why, unfortunately, a majority voted for Brexit 2 years ago, and there was a single issue behind it, the single issue was immigration, that they can't even agree amongst themselves whether they want to maintain something like freedom of movement or whether they want tight immigration controls. They fall apart on that issue as soon as three of them are gathered in a room together. So one thing I'm now sure of, having gone through the last 2 years and been debating this all the time, is if you get Jacob Rees-Mogg, Nigel Farage, John Redwood, Boris Johnson, Michael Gove, so the five prime levers in a room together, you will not be able to get them to agree on a Leave proposition which is different from Theresa May's. And they won't, firstly because they don't agree, but secondly because they daren't agree, because the one thing Nigel Farage is not going to do is tie himself down to a specific proposal that actually involves a huge amount of European integration. Why? Because he's a populist who trades on claiming the impossible. That's why he's been so successful. He has spent 20 years telling the British people that you can have your cake and eat it. You can have all of the benefits economically of being in Europe without having any of the obligations. Well, as a populist who deals in slogans, you can do that. But when it actually comes to having to define on a piece of paper what exactly this is going to mean, you can't do that. So what we've got to do in Parliament when it comes to this issue, but why will you not have no deal or a straight leave option on the ballot paper, is say, as a matter of principle, you cannot have on the ballot paper something which is not defined precisely, because remember, we were there 2 years ago. Part of the reason we're in this mess is that there was an imprecise leave option put down. And you also cannot have on the ballot paper something which cannot be implemented. And a straight leave proposition can't be implemented, because what does that mean for all the things I've just talked about? Now, as soon as you explain this to people, they understand that. This isn't trying to game or be unfair. It's just, you know, we're dealing in the real world. You can't have an imprecise proposal which can't be implemented. And for that reason, I don't think that there will be a third option. And I'm fairly sure that the same majority that I was talking about a moment ago that will say that there has to be a leave option on the ballot paper would also say you cannot have an undefined, impossible leave option on the ballot paper. And the reason why you can't is precisely because of the reason that you've given, which is if people were, because of the way that the campaign might go in a very populist way, to vote for it, what's Parliament supposed to do afterwards? Say, OK, we're going to have no trade from the end of next March. Heathrow is going to close. The ports aren't going to operate. Why? Because 51% of the population were hoodwinked into thinking this was a possible proposition. Parliament cannot behave like that. It has certain fundamental duties, one of which is only to put before people propositions which are viable. And straight leave is not viable. If it was viable, Theresa May would have proposed it a long time ago, but she hasn't been able to. Also, the other thing they've got to have on the ballot paper is what they're going to do about the Irish border. This is a fundamental thing. What is their proposal going to do? It's not good enough in a referendum for Farage to say that Ireland is tiddly and it should leave the European Union. That isn't a viable proposal which Parliament can implement next March. I mean, it's a ludicrous, it's just not viable. It simply cannot be done. And so because it can't be done, it can't go on the ballot paper. If it was possible to have Norway plus customs union, do you know, I think there might be a majority in Parliament for that, but I can't begin to see how Theresa May gets there, because that crosses all of her red lines, and so on now, all of it. Yeah, but she's shown no sign of being able to move there. My own view is that if she had said immediately after the referendum, look, people voted to leave. The main reason it appears that they voted to leave was because of very high levels of immigration, which was my view of what happened, if you were trying to distill what happened in the referendum. Therefore, but they didn't vote to be poorer and not to have trading relations with Europe. Therefore, the right thing for us to do is to stay in the single market, stay in the customs union, but have a special deal on freedom of movement. If she had said that immediately after the referendum, A, I think she could probably have negotiated that. I think that was a negotiable proposition. And second, I think she could probably have carried most people with her. Not because people like me and you would necessarily have agreed with it, but it's viable, it's sensible, it doesn't trash the country, and it leaves open the option that we could go back in again quite easily in the future. The reason we're in this situation is that from the beginning she's defined herself against that. And she shows no sign whatever of moving towards it. On the contrary, she has said that leaving the single market and the customs union is a complete red line. The reason why she did this elaborate checkers thing was to have a version of the customs union that wasn't the customs union, but was still leaving the single market. So she would need to perform a somersault, which she's showing no signs of doing. But my honest answer to your question is, if she was capable of doing it, then we might be in a different place. But I see no indication whatsoever that she's capable of doing it. The other point about it too, because of some of the debate that's going on at the moment that she might be able to move, is it's not good enough to do that as an interim position. That would have to be a permanent position. To say, as some people are saying now, but we could do what's called Norway for now, well, what happens after now? This is the big issue about the gangplank into thin air. So she would need to do something which I just don't think is politically possible for her, which is not only to do something like Norway and the customs union, but she'd need to give a commitment in a treaty and to tell the British Parliament that she was doing it as the permanent settlement. Now, it's very clear because of her own red lines and the position of the Conservative Party that she couldn't carry that at the moment. So I don't think that that's in any way likely. I don't think it's going to be possible for us to hold a referendum before the end of next March, being realistic, because it doesn't look as if we'll have the parliamentary votes before December or January, and it takes a few months to pass the legislation and you have to have a referendum campaign. But I don't think that's the point, because all of those people who know, and including what our European allies have been telling us, is that provided we ask for an extension of what's called this Article 50 period, which is the period of negotiations while we stay in the European Union, provided we ask for that for the purposes of holding a referendum, so that's the reason why we ask for it, they will grant it. And the reason they will grant it, and the President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, has all but said that, he said it privately to people like me very firmly, the reason they will do it and why we can be so sure of it is precisely because the European Union is a club of democracies. It's very important to understand that. You wouldn't believe it from the coverage in the right-wing Tory press about it being a dictatorship from Brussels and all of that. But every treaty and action of the European Union has to be agreed by its member states. Now, it's true that being a club, you have to get to a process of consensus to something everybody can agree on, but they all do agree on it. Some European Union treaties take years for states to ratify, and it is true that in some cases they hold more than one referendum. People say that's because they're being, in this surreal way, they're being forced to hold these referendums. Well, there's no European army, there's no one who forced Denmark and forced Ireland to hold two referendums. Their governments themselves chose, as a matter of democratic free will, to hold these votes again. But because of that, they will definitely give us the time to hold another referendum, because being a club of democracies, if we need more time through our democratic processes to decide what we're going to do, they'll grant it. So time isn't the issue. The issue is getting a parliamentary majority to ask for the extension of Article 50 and to vote for the referendum. If there's a parliamentary majority to do those, we will be able to sort out the timing issues. Whether we need 3 months to do it before next summer or 6 months to hold the referendum next September or October, that's absolutely doable. I think these issues of peace and war are pretty emotional myself, and I think we need to start hearing a lot more about those in a referendum campaign and in the public debate. I'm not sure, to be absolutely frank, given our political culture, particularly in England, that having our continental friends coming and making the argument is going to do a great job of persuading Middle English opinion. I hugely regret that that's the case, but by and large, that hasn't been a productive way of persuading people in England. However, what is important is that our continental friends, and in particular Chancellor Merkel and President Macron, who are basically the two arbiters of the European Union at the moment, that they make it very clear, very publicly and repeatedly, if we have a referendum, that they want us to stay. That the only thing preventing us staying is ourselves. It's nothing to do with the European Union not wanting us. Now, to be fair to them, they have said that repeatedly so far. Provided they carry on saying that, then the argument that somehow we're being ejected will be much harder to run. But that's an argument which the Brexiters are trying to run, is that we're being unfairly treated, being discriminated against in some way by Brussels and by the European Union. We've got to deal with that argument, and the best way of dealing with that argument is for President Macron and Chancellor Merkel to make very clear that what they want is for us to stay. The reason is that she doesn't see any other way of holding her party together. Because of this reverse takeover that's happened with UKIP taking it over, because the Conservative grassroots are overwhelmingly and passionately anti-European. They're very, very unrepresentative of public opinion. And it's very difficult to survive as a Conservative MP at the moment, unless you declare yourself against Europe and all its works. So the lowest common denominator in the Conservative Party is Brexit. And the one thing that they're almost all agreed on is we've got to make some form of Brexit work, or else we'll fall apart as a party, which is the very reason why David Cameron held the referendum 4 years ago, because this has been, as always in this game, a process of appeasement all the way through. He tried to hold the party together with the promise of a referendum, hoping he would never have to hold it. Because remember, he made that pledge in 2013 when he thought he was going to lose the following election, or he'd be in continuing coalition with the Lib Dems. So his bluff was called, to his huge regret, which meant he had to hold it. Then, to be fair to him, because what these memoirs say, he did then, of course, argue that we should stay. But unfortunately, he'd lost control of the situation by then. This was a big problem, including he'd lost control of his own party. So the most popular figure in the party then was Boris Johnson, who immediately declared himself against for entirely opportunist reasons. So that's the reason why Theresa May is doing it. She cannot see any other way of holding her party together. And the problem, if you're a Conservative, is that party unity is the thing which, unfortunately, comes first and foremost. It takes huge it takes huge courage to lead against the overwhelming majority in your party, and unfortunately Theresa May isn't a Churchillian type leader who's prepared to do that. Now, will they come to bitterly regret it and pay a price for it in due course? I very much hope so. Maybe they will. It depends how this whole thing turns out, doesn't it? It may be the electorate saved them from it, because if there's a people's vote and we vote to stay in, what of course will then happen inside the Conservative Party is they'll have to get a leader who is more pro-European, who will then disown everything that's happened in the past. And the Conservatives are very, very good at reinventing themselves quite quickly. So the British people may actually give them a get-out-of-jail-free card on this. What I think could destroy them, actually, is if we do Brexit, it turns out to be a great disaster, and they will not be able to duck responsibility for that. The best thing that could happen to them is that the British people essentially overrule them and say that we're staying, and then they can claim that that was their idea all along. This is, or the new leader can claim it was his or her idea all along. So I hate to intrude on domestic Scottish politics, but this could well be the role that Ruth Davidson ends up playing. I'm not sure whether she's what's going to happen in the next Scottish election, but I could easily see her coming down and becoming, in that kind of situation, leader of the Conservative Party in the UK, claiming that I had nothing whatever to do with this Brexit thing. I was up in Edinburgh, while all this was happening, which in a fundamental sense is true. She's not got any responsibility for the Brexit thing directly. So the Conservatives are very good at this, very, very good. Look at how, they lied from Chamberlain to Churchill. They move literally 180 degrees, and it's almost as if this had always been intended to happen, even though it wasn't quite intended. So. Crucial thing all I can do is explain to you. I can't justify it, because of course what's my view is that we shouldn't do any of this Brexit thing, and it's all a big mistake. And as I say, irrespective of what happens in terms of relations between England and Scotland over the next generation, the right thing is for us both to be in the European Union, come what may. But you've got to understand the Conservative mindset in England, which basically doesn't really take account of other parts of the United Kingdom at all. It's very important to understand this. Almost no Conservatives know anything about Ireland. They never visit it. They know nothing about it at all. It's a kind of rhetorical construct. It's nothing more than that. They don't have much to do with Scotland either. They have a bit more understanding of Scotland because there are some Scottish Conservative MPs, but not much more. And it's always subordinate to the interests of England, because the Conservative Party, properly understood, is essentially an English national party. So are they prepared to run these risks? The answer, regrettably, is that they are, partly because they don't recognise the risks, because they don't actually think that they're of big account. This is, unfortunately, part of the problem. Now, those of us who do recognise them, this is part of the reason why we're here making these arguments, is precisely because we think it would be a huge mistake for that to happen. But the only way I can explain to you the Conservative Party isn't to try and explain that they have some great plan, it's that they don't recognise it at all. I'm afraid that it's a much more fundamental problem. It's a complete lack of understanding and this belief that basically the decisions that they take should be the ones that matter for England and everybody else will fall into line, which is a kind of imperial mindset, because to be blunt, that's roughly how England has ordered its relations with the Empire and its relations inside the United Kingdom from time immemorial. It's part of the reason why, in particular, relations with Ireland have been so bad, because it's been England first and Ireland has to fall into line. At least with Scotland, the relationship has been more complex because Scotland itself has played a very big part in the Conservative Party and in British politics. So the relationship's always been much closer, whereas with Ireland, it's basically been severed over the last century. What does this mean for what might happen in Scotland and all that? The truth is, I can't predict. All I can say is it makes everything much more unpredictable, and in the case of Ireland, positively dangerous. It's unpredictable what will happen inside the UK. I don't know what will happen. I can't believe it's going to promote greater harmony between England and Scotland. I can't see how there's a more positive scenario. I mean, you tell me. It only looks to me as it's got a negative scenario, not a positive one. In the case of Ireland, though, the reason I've made so much of it is I think that the consequences there could be very serious indeed. And the point about it is when people talk glibly about a united Ireland, and I personally am not against United Ireland, that's what the people of Northern Ireland want. Indeed, the United Kingdom has said that in the Good Friday Agreement, where the United Kingdom, the government of the United Kingdom said we have no selfish or strategic interest in Northern Ireland, and that if there's support for a border poll and a majority of Northern Ireland votes, then the United Kingdom would respect that. The problem, and this is the reason why it's so serious, is anybody who knows anything about the politics of Northern Ireland and the society in Northern Ireland is that the only way you're going to move towards a united Ireland by consent, which may be the right thing for Ireland, is if you can carry both communities. If you don't carry both communities, then you could be setting yourselves up for a different form of terrorism. And the crucial thing to understand, is I've got to understand the history of Northern Ireland more, is we spent the last generation worrying rightly about nationalist and republican violence because we've had the IRA. The crucial thing to understand is that what created Northern Ireland in the first place was Protestant stroke unionist violence. It was Edward Carson who basically declared UDI. It was a kind of Ian Smith type, if you think about our generation, type movement, where you had, let's be clear what happened. It's very important to, because, we're in a very serious situation, so we should be blunt about what happened in the past. Before the First World War, when the then Liberal government tried to introduce Home Rule, which was basically something like the Scottish Parliament for Ireland, for the whole of Ireland, the Northern Irish Unionists not only declared that they wouldn't do it, but with the support of the Conservative Party in London, started gun running in Northern Ireland, smuggling German arms into Larne. And you had this thing called the Curragh Mutiny, where Northern Irish Protestant army officers refused to obey orders from the government in London. We just need, those of you who aren't familiar with the history, need to think about what all that means for a moment. It was nationalist paramilitary activity which came very close to civil war, which is the reason why Northern Ireland was created. So if we get this badly wrong and we move towards some form of united Ireland, because basically you get there's a majority in support, but with a lot of the DUP type end of the political spectrum bitterly against, and I can assure you they will be bitterly against. What you could easily get if we get this wrong is a recurrence of unionist violence and paramilitary activity in Northern Ireland. And the truth of the matter is, it doesn't really matter when the bombs that go off in London have got IRA marked on them or some unionist paramilitary group. They are still bombs, they still go off and they still kill people, and they will still make life a misery for the people of Northern Ireland who are subject to it. So the reason why Ireland is so important in all this is that whereas in the UK, in Great Britain, we have big issues which we have to resolve, but we have now got a culture of resolving them peacefully. That is simply not the case in Ireland. It's simply not the case. 3,500 people were killed in the Troubles, and that was between 1969 and 1998. You know, when this guy, I don't know if the name Daniel Hannan means anything to you, is one of these Tory MEPs who glibly talks about things. Daniel Hannan says in one of the most chilling things that's been said on this Brexit thing, that the Good Friday Agreement, he says the Good Friday Agreement was the consequence, not the cause, of peace in Northern Ireland. You need to think about that for a moment. The year that the Good Friday Agreement was signed, which was 1998, there were 50 terrorist deaths in Northern Ireland, and hundreds were being maimed. But they're prepared to play fast and loose on this in order to claim that there's no danger of a recurrence of paramilitary activity in Northern Ireland. Sorry. So the situation is very, very serious there. But what is bringing all this together, what's the conclusion we should draw, is not to appease Brexit, somehow that there are good Brexits and bad Brexits, but to oppose Brexit totally, to campaign like mad for a people's vote over the next few months, and if we get the people's vote, basically to do everything we can, organising in our communities and all of that, to get the biggest possible vote that we can to remain. And I'm absolutely convinced that we can win this because we've got the best arguments, including the best emotional arguments. Peace, stability, freedom, not making our children poorer. I mean, if that isn't an emotional set of arguments, then I don't know what is.
Thanks very much.